appreciate you so much. These conversations are really important, and I know there's a lot of folks doing events, and there's a lot of content out there, and there's a lot of stuff to absorb. But I really believe in the amplification and elevation of conversation in real time, to check in with each other on a human level, to just check in. So I want to introduce my guests. Joan Walsh is the nation's national affairs correspondent, a CNN political contributor, and the author of What's the Matter with White People? Finding Our Way in the Next America. Walsh served as Salon's first news editor and has appeared on CNN, HBO, and PBS, in addition to writing for the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Joan. Tanzina Vega, I know folks up in here for Tanzina Vega, is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and speaker on issues of race, media, and inequality in the United States. She is the new host of WNYC's The Takeaway, an Eisner Fellow at the Nation Institute, the author of the forthcoming book Uppity, and a Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Tanzina, come on out. Blair Imani is an author and activist living at the intersection of Black, queer, and Muslim identity. Imani is the author of Modern Her Story, Stories of Women and Non-Binary People, Rewriting History. She is also the founder and executive director of Equality for Her, a nonprofit educational platform for women and non-binary people. Blair. Oh, I love this. I love this group of women so much. So I was a huge fan of Eddie Murphy in the 80s, which of course was his moment, right? When he was everywhere and in everything, the peak of his career. I remember going to see 48 Hours, which I don't even know. I think I was like 13 when that came out, and I wasn't allowed to see it because it was an R movie. Probably it was that, I grew up in rural New Hampshire and nobody checked IDs or anything. But in any event, I went and I loved it and da-da-da-da. And the movie 48 Hours co-stars Nick Nolte as this sort of rough, rogue white cop who needs to get Eddie Murphy out of prison to help him track down a bad guy. And so last month or so, I was feeling nostalgic, as I often do. And I was like, let me watch that movie on demand. Oh my God, you guys, oh my God. And I realized that there were all of these moments in popular culture, movies, television in particular, with these blatantly racist moments. And I'm not talking about like Amos and Andy, Birth of a Nation, 1915, 1920 or whatnot. I'm talking about moments when people were racist in the movies or in television and it went unchallenged. Obviously we're living in a time of think pieces and so on and so forth, and a time when
Black Twitter.
Yes, exactly, and when we can capture what's going on and so on and so forth. But I just started to think, what do we do with those moments from the past? And so we put together a montage just to jog y'all's memory.
You're just a spear chucker with a number stenciled on the back of his prison fatigues. Let me explain one thing to you, nigger. I fight dirty.
Very clever dinner.
Cute sign, Chief.
Yeah. Fucking ACLU, commie Jew bastards. Made us take it down. Used to be out front. Don't make no difference. Ain't no nigger gonna stay in this town after sundown.
Nengue! Nengue Mboko! From Cameroon! Do you remember me? It's Lionel Joseph.
Lionel! From the African Education Conference, right?
Yes, Simon! I was director of cultural events at the Haile Selassie Pavilion.
I remember the pavilion. We had big fun there.
So,
Yikes.
yeah, yikes. So tonight we're talking about what do we do, or how do we look at that kind of racism from decades past, and what is the response to the racist firings that are happening today? So we've seen an uptick, right, today in racists being fired, which I think is, in part, it's in part because we can capture them on our phones or in social media, and also because we're living in Trump's America, which has emboldened racists across the country. But so what do we do with the racism that we couldn't capture? And I want to start with you, Joan, because you've been writing about race and racism as a white woman, which you are, for a number of years. And so what is your recollection of covering race and racism in the 80s?
I think it was mainly covered as a problem. So, I also covered education and poverty issues. And it was actually hard to get positive stories about communities, doing stuff for themselves and improving, published. There was a real storyline that you had to conform to. I was there for the crack baby phenomenon. Thank God I never wrote about it.
But had you written about it, what would it have been? Right? So
right.
You said I wrote about education and poverty and so on and so forth, which then suggests that is race.
That's race, exactly. And that, I think, was the experience of white editors, coming up in white institutions, white editors. And then I have to give a shout out to Sandy Close at Pacific News Service. She really treated race as an opportunity. She was curious. And she started assigning me stories about whiteness, which was also mind-blowing because whiteness was not yet a concept to me as woke as I thought I was in the 90s.
Which wasn't the word that you used.
No,
then.
not at all. I don't.
Conscious.
What? Down? Was I down? I don't know.
Conscious, right?
In the 90s.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I tried.
With it.
I tried. That's all I can say. I tried. Didn't always succeed. But so that I think that I wound up having a very different experience, and feeling like the whiteness stories. I remember I did a story on. It was the year, and I'm not remembering when, but I think it was about 1990. White students, the freshman class at UC Berkeley, for the first time was not majority white. And talking to white students about their whiteness and first encountering that sense of grievance and that, everything's being taken away from us.
In 1990.
In 1990, the college Republicans had been dead at Berkeley, right, for like 30, 40 years, and suddenly there was a college Republican chapter, and it was all white. And so really, I should have paid more. I did write about that, but I was watching the change, but also the reaction to the change, and I consider myself lucky.
I'm so curious, and you and I have sort of glossed over this a little bit, but I'm so curious as to how you came about being interested in writing about race as a white journalist.
I do write about this in my book. And I'm not saying you have to read my book. I'm just taking a breath to think about.
You should read her book.
Thank you.
I was telling Joan, I was so excited to meet her, simultaneously kicking myself for not bringing my print version of the book, because I love reading a book with the cover that says, "What's the matter with white people?" or "What's wrong with white people?"
What's the matter?
Yeah, what's the matter with white people in public places as a Black woman. because it's such an
Thank
elegant
you.
thing, but it's also so remarkable to not be the only one having to say it, for it not to be coming from the community, and for people to really be reckoning and grappling with race and whiteness in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I give all credit to my parents, and particularly my father. My father was just a really raised Catholic, Irish Catholic, sent away to Christian Brothers boarding school to become a Christian brother, just really took in Catholic social justice teaching. But so here's a story that I've told over the years, and the way that I tell it has evolved, because some people find it really offensive. So but I'm just going to put it out there. He told me that we were Black Irish, that Irish people with dark hair were the product of Moors and the Irish mixing, and therefore I could be part Black. Now, I never thought I was part Black, but it was such a profound exercise in empathy, in that you can't hate anybody because you could be related to them. And so it made such a deep impression on me. And then when I did Ancestry, I'm 91%
Oh my
Irish.
God.
I'm
You did Ancestry?
I'm 91% Irish, and I'm 6% Iberian Peninsula. So he was right. Anyway,
Guys, I'm so freaked out by Ancestry.
I know. So is
Oh,
my
I love
sister.
it.
My sister won't do it.
I feel like it's one more albatross. I just can't.
I get
But
you.
you-
But I was just raised, and I'm older than you are. I was raised with the images of, the police dogs and the fire hoses trained on protesters. There was just a real clear sense of black and white, right, wrong. And being a Catholic, it was clear what you had to do. So, how I wound up writing so much about it, I almost can't answer. It was just what I was curious about as I got older.
Tanzina, so much of the conversation over the years has been, when we talk about racism, it's been black-white, right? And I think that there is a real, there's a real argument to be made that anti-black racism is prevalent, right? But you have obviously experienced that, and you grew up in the East Village, Lower East Side. And do you remember in the 80s sort of watching popular culture and considering how you or other black and brown folks were depicted?
I know that we weren't depicted. I can tell you that watching Sesame Street and Maria,
Yes.
Maria.
and her husband, whose name I'm forgetting.
Gordon.
Because,
No,
Louise, sorry.
Gordon was the
Susan
black
and Gordon.
character.
Yeah, okay.
Luis
and
and
Maria.
Maria, and yes, so that was the first time I remember seeing people who actually Maria was Puerto Rican, the original actress, so it was like literally me, right, on the on TV. But I also remember the sitcom wave of the 80s when I looked like no one, and when I was a teenager, and I was devastated. I wanted to change my name, my face, my hair, my nose, like just everything about what I was, because that was not the aesthetic that was attractive in the
whoever the young
80s.
folks are, a lot of young folks out here, the sitcom wave of the 80s was
White and blonde.
But no, name some of the shows.
Oh, sorry. Who's the Boss?
Oh, that was a big one. But Tony Danza was on that show.
Yeah, but still, but
Yeah,
Alyssa
okay.
Milano was
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I
yeah.
was looking at, right?
Right,
And that
sure.
was like God, if only I could look like that.
Right.
And if only
And
my
that's the
hair-
other
and-
thing, is that even when there were folks of color on these shows, they looked
And they
Right.
also, and it was the same aesthetic. It wasn't
Right.
just TV. It was magazines. So teenage magazines at the time, YM, and all these other, whatever the equivalent of that would be, 17. Also the same thing. And I'll never forget, there was a magazine called Sassy,
Oh yeah.
which was amazing, and y'all missed it, and I'm really sorry you did. But my mother bought me the first copy, because the girl on the cover had a nose that looked like mine. And she never heard of the magazine. She just said, I know you're traumatized by, and then I had braces, and it was like horrible. So she goes, look at this woman who has a nose just like yours. And I was blown away. It was the first time I'd ever seen someone that looked even remotely like me. So I think that was a big hole. It was a huge hole. It made a lot of us feel insecure. And then you're not even talking about class, right? I remember thinking, oh, must be nice to live in that house. Because I lived in an apartment in public housing. So it was just this idea of you having a backyard. Wow, and having a back door, right? There are options. Right? You could come in going upstairs. Like the things that I think America takes for granted when you're growing up in inner city New York in the 80s, it didn't look anything like what I was surrounded with.
I want to bring it back a little bit to sort of this accountability and how there's this uptick in looking at racism and there being real material consequences for racism, and that it's partly a function of technology and the Trump administration, and we can document this stuff. But I also wonder, Blair, if you think it is partly because Black and brown folks are taking up space and agency.
I definitely think that has something to do with it. As we were talking backstage in the green room, and I'm hearing kind of and seeing that montage as well, it contrasts so much with what I grew up with, which was like seeing the Proud Family. We had Ni Hao Kai Lan, which was about a Chinese girl teaching us Mandarin, and seeing Dora the Explorer, and really just I'm thinking now about how much representation we have and how much further we have to go. But I think that there are people who are even younger than me who are just so fed up with this racism because we've grown up in such a quote unquote progressive time, being promised what Obama's legacy was going to be, the kind of like people were, my grandmother was even acting like he was the second coming of Jesus, and then to still be experiencing police brutality. I think it has really created this very righteous fury in the hearts and minds of a lot of young people. And so when we're seeing this casual racism happening, we have been taught to, be armed with our phones and our cameras and to document these things. But it is a great day on Twitter whenever we see these racists getting fired, because within a matter of hours, who was it? Permit Patty, who had called the police on a young Black girl who was selling water. And that resonated with me because the one time I had a lemonade stand like you're supposed to in America, the police got called on me, and there was a white woman who pulled over. We were like right across the street from the park. We were the only Black family in the neighborhood, and she said that we were selling drugs. And I didn't even connect the dots.
Wasn't Permit Patty selling drugs?
Right? No, but she was actually selling
legally
drugs. Yeah.
Right?
But when I was a child, I never even connected the dots that this was a racialized incident, that it was racism. But then so seeing the Permit Patty story, and this woman, just so y'all know, was selling, she had a company where she was selling weed to dogs. She has since been fired because...
To dogs,
right? Mm-hmm. And she's like calling the police on a little girl who's selling water. But it's a great feeling to see that these isolated incidents are being addressed, but I think it's also harmful because there are people now and kind of throughout American society who believe that racism is a series of isolated incidents versus a systemic issue that is being propped up by these Permit Patties and barbecue Beckys who are reinforcing the system of whiteness. But I think that we are an emboldened generation, but it's not new, because I think about folks like Sammy Young, who was, I can't recall the year, but he was the first Black student at an HBCU to be killed during the Civil Rights Movement. And he was using a white-only restroom. So he had that same righteous indignation, and he was killed. And my Uncle Roby was actually friends with him. And so to see this same righteous indignation coming from young people, it's nothing new. I think that young people have always been leading the way, but it's great to see folks really shifting the tides on what is acceptable in public discourse, because we aren't being killed for using the restroom, but still trans people are being denied the right to use the restroom of their choice.
All of that, for sure. But I also feel like, obviously looking at racism, calling out racism is not new. That racism was actually a founding factor of the country, the founding factor, perhaps. I guess what I want to get at a little bit is, what becomes of Walter Hill, the writer and director of 48 Hours? what becomes of, whoever decided that it was okay to put that sign in that scene with Don Johnson? How do we revisit that in a way that is productive and just and sophisticated, for lack of a better term? Tanzina, do you have thoughts on that?
I'm thinking it took us this long to see the open secret of Harvey Weinstein, right? And so I think part of how that happened and part of how we see this type of representation happening back in the 80s, and I would argue, even somewhat into the 90s, and even, depending on what you're watching, it's just, I hate to keep talking about this, but it's who's in the room. And this. It's about who's making these decisions, where the money's coming from. I don't know how much accountability there really is when it comes to that. I think that you see quick accountability, right? Companies that say, oh, I don't want Aaron Schlossberg working for my law firm, or was it his own law firm or whatever, whoever got rid of Aaron Schlossberg and all the permit patties and that sort of immediate, let's cover our what, right? So that we get rid of this person. I don't know how you change it systemically, right? These representations in media are, and we see this in newsrooms, it's not just in Hollywood, right?
For sure. Yeah.
How did that headline make it on that story? Who was asked, right? And I think that's the lack of accountability that we have, and I'm trying to avoid using the D word right now, diversity, right? But I really do think that's a part of the problem.
Right. And also, though, I think that...
Do we relitigate it? I don't know.
Do we relitigate? But also, if we're looking backwards, when we didn't have the cell phones, when we didn't have a way to document it, and I think, and I ran this by my counsel, my family counsel, to talk about, when I was at a previous gig at an online media company, in an editorial meeting, a white woman editor used the N-word freely. And I looked at her aghast, and she looked at me like, what? And so I wonder, in terms of, is it a personal vendetta versus is it something that America at large needs to address and embrace and look at? Do you know what I'm saying, Blair?
Yeah. I was just thinking about how we address the harm of it, right? And it reminded me of on Cartoon Network in the late at night before they had Adult Swim, they would show these kind of Chuck Jones cartoons reckoning with the racism, because Chuck Jones, the creator of Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes, those just like Disney, except Disney never really accounted for it. But Chuck Jones would have these very racist caricatures of Chinese people, of black people, Bugs Bunny in blackface, yellowface, you name it, and they would do these shows really talking about the historical context and really accounting for it and educating viewers about it. And I thought that was so radical, watching it kind of in my teens, because those were movies that my grandfather watched, that he really enjoyed, but then also thinking about the harm that it had done to just people who embraced mainstream media and embraced these racist caricatures. And so I think that was a really novel way to approach healing from, as I guess as an audience or as a viewership, the harms of racism, was to learn about why it happened and to acknowledge that it happened, versus what Disney has done, kind of the counterpart at the time, which was just bury all of the horribly racist propaganda cartoons that it created during the Second World War, for example. If you look on YouTube, you can just kind of see Disney's dirty laundry in terms of racist cartoons, but Chuck Jones has all of these documentaries talking to diversity and inclusion experts about what harms this allowed to happen and why it happened and who made those decisions. And I thought that was a great way to make it transparent and to make it plain, instead of acting like it never happened in the first place. Because if we can't acknowledge the harm, then we can never heal from it.
Right, and yeah, I agree with that. I think you do need to not necessarily relitigate it, but it's the job of academics as much as it is the job of artists and media creators in many ways to do exactly what you're talking about, right? To re-examine this, to take a look at this and say, okay, let's put this in context, right? It's been, 30 years since a lot of these films have happened. If you're talking about race, if you're talking about any of these topics in academia, in culture, in art, we need to be able to bring this up and contextualize how we got here. And I think we lose a lot of that.
Yeah, because I also feel like, we've talked a lot in culture, in academe, about racism as a social construct. But I feel like certainly since Trump became president, that racism is more a sort of violent domestic terrorism, which is what it
has always
be from the beginning, right? And then we had all of these years of, it's a social construct, it's a social construct. But now to me it feels like it's going back to that real violent domestic terrorism.
And who are we trying to educate to? That's the other question I have.
It's hard to hold both things, but we have to. It is a social construct, but it's a really violent and dangerous one that I think a lot of white people, even well-meaning white people, will say, well, it's a social construct, why are you tripping about it? When I started writing, for example, I did a piece about multiracial students at Berkeley. And there were scholars of multiracialism. There are, it's proliferated, but this was the early 90s. But I remember the first time I encountered someone who was black and white, who was just militantly, that's a terrible word, but I'm black. And really, I know like this is late for me, but to really grapple with the idea that it's all well and good for me to say, multiracialism, what was that line in Bulworth? We're going to F our way.
Bulworth? You're going to reference Bulworth?
Well, yes.
Oh, damn, girl. Okay.
I know. I watched it recently. Oh, my God. I mean, talk about unenlightened. But it was supposed to be enlightened. But my point is the notion that we can, reproduce our way out of our racial problems.
To racial equality. That's what was so frustrating for me when Obama was running for office, was that people kept looking to me and other folks, in my community as like heralds of a new generation.
You're the bridge.
Yeah, you're the voice of young Black America. But they wouldn't be asking my, darker skinned counterparts what they thought. It was very much we're giving you a carrot of white proximity so that way you can erase, the realities of racism. And through multiculturalism, we will, see the end of racism, when really we'll just be silencing folks who are further marginalized.
But also, I think it's important to note, and Tanzina, you mentioned the D word, all of these kind of concepts, diversity, multiculturalism, who comes up with these concepts? Who puts these words out into the world?
I'm tired. Academics in a lot of ways, but
but white academics. Right?
Well, that's what I mean. Like, I think there's a frustration point as a woman of color of saying, I'm tired of explaining the basic fundamentals of how this country was founded, what it was founded on, and the impact that has had on us today. And it is an absolute chore sometimes to have to continue to do that, because we can't be that blind, right? We can't. We all sat here and watched those clips, and we all probably felt, well, that was pretty awful, right? We know that. This idea that we have to prove once again how bad it really was and how bad it really is, even with video and audio and in your face, people losing their job. It's like, I'm done. Turn on the TV. Turn on the radio, turn on our show, and find out for yourself. I think there has to be some accountability on the part of white people also to say, we got to figure this out.
Also? Primarily,
I
would say.
I'm being gentle.
Yeah.
I think for me it's interesting because I have, in an interesting way, am reaping the benefits of this diversity industry, because suddenly there are these all-white corporations who feel like they can solve diversity and inclusion issues by bringing in somebody who checks quite a few boxes. I'm a Black, queer, Muslim woman. I will take your checks, and I will try to educate you. But I think that folks need to also reckon with the pipelines that have been created. There's people who are in boardrooms who believe these stereotypes that they've seen on TV in the 80s and 90s and, into today, especially with the way Muslims are depicted. It's so rare that you hear an adhan, which is a beautiful call to prayer, and you don't hear a violent explosion happen. I remember like the awkwardness of hearing a roommate listen to one of those movies and being like, oh, how awkward, I'm actually Muslim, you know? But I think that we have to look at the consequences of why people believe that Black folks, that, you know, Latinos, et cetera, are less than when they've been inundated with these ideologies in popular media, in the news. It's all this bias that creates this monster that just allows white supremacy to continue to exist. But it also pays my bills because I do all these speaking events.
But I'm not saying I wouldn't take a check to teach you. I'm just saying.
This brings me back
that's different.
to the central question of the evening, which is, okay, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 5 years ago, somebody was racist towards you, or you witnessed it or whatnot. What happens to that person?
They go on to live and be employed. I mean,
I'm saying, what
should happen?
What should happen?
But this is what I'm saying, is that it doesn't happen, right?
I
So
know it
even
doesn't
when
happen. That's why we're having the
frustration.
conversation.
Yeah.
I'm saying what should happen.
The interesting thing, though, is it might happen if it's a viral moment. My friend Ziwe Famudo recently said that the line between you and justice shouldn't be virality on Twitter, but so often it is. Yeah. What does happen if somebody was racist to you 5 years ago and you have it well documented is that you have a viral moment and that person might get called out, that their employer might find out about it, but it's all facilitated so often through social media. But if I go back to Sammy Young, that example where, you know, he was murdered in broad daylight, you know, hundreds of witnesses, and the man who killed him was acquitted. And in 2011, his case is closed because everyone has died who was a witness of the case.
Speaking of which, Emmett Till,
especially. Right. And so with Sammy's case, you know, he was a young man struck down in his prime, and he was actually a military veteran. And in 2011, the American government decided that he doesn't get justice. And it's comes to a conversation of reparations for me, because if you know, or were unemployed, for example, and like a more casual racism case where you were unemployed because you might have gotten hired, but they saw that your name was Jamal on a resume and that was thrown away, that comes to a reparations issue for me, because that's economic disempowerment, where you're denying people the funds to direct their own future because of your racial bias in a hiring system. And so it would be, especially in this government, I feel like impossible to catalog those incidences of racism and create a system of wealth redistribution. But it's also been, you know, we've dealt with this system of oppression for so long, then what does the future of liberation look like? So I think it would have to be some type of a new system that we would have to create. And I don't want to knock that possibility from coming into fruition at some point in time.
Joan, what should happen?
I think it depends. I hate to be so wishy-washy, but, you know, I think that if people show, you know, we need to use an example. Should we use the Mark Wahlberg example?
Yes, sure.
You know, apparently in his youth, he was a violent racist against apparently well proven, yes. Convicted. Mm-hmm. And he was against Black people,
Asian
people. And he at some point petitioned to have his record expunged, and with a kind of sense of entitlement. And of course, you know, I believe in second chances, especially for young people, but the entitlement of his request and his lack of evident, you know, remorse and growth just kind of made me gag. So do you see remorse if something's really egregious, or do you see growth? You know, for example, the story I was telling about my foray into racialism and meeting this Black person who took the time to educate me why she was not rushing to consider herself biracial, or what was Tiger Woods, Calabinasian.
He's the only one. He's the only one who ever said that about himself. Yeah,
Blasian. Yeah.
No, it did not catch on.
Yeah, no, it really didn't. No.
You know, so I went into that kind of insensitive and ignorant, and came out a little bit less insensitive and ignorant, and hopefully, you know, make progress along the way. I think you need to see signs of progress, and I think you need to hold people accountable.
Okay, so the other thing is that, I mean, been a bunch of stuff that's just been sort of gifted to this conversation. You know, the Emmett Till case is being reopened. This fellow who is a baseball player, and I only know it because my husband and son were watching Sports Center today, and it was this guy who spewed racist Jason. I forget. Pardon? Yes, thank you. Spewed racist tweets 7 years ago, and is now saying, you know, I wasn't that person. I'm a different person than I was then. And I guess my question, my concern is, you are the same person.
Yeah.
Right? That says that. So tell me what it is that goes through your mind that allows you or informs you to say, I'm not that person. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like
the worst thing to call one of the worst things to call particularly white Americans in this country is racist. And so any public shaming of that, any public acknowledgement of that, especially today, is going to be an immediate walk back.
I
right?
understand that. I understand that. What I don't understand is people saying, I'm not that person. I'm not the person I was then. Because you are.
I think I get it because, so we have to look at like the systems, right? Not just the individual incidents. And so I think that, you know, however many years ago, you were conforming to this system of white supremacy where you could say those things and you know, could other people, you know? And so today we're moving, I think, in a more progressive direction, inshallah, which is not a curse. That's me just saying, God willing. People get all freaked out when you throw Arabic around. But I think that because now it's so unpopular to be that person vocally and boldly, that it's a walking back of, oh, I didn't know, like the status quo back then doesn't equal the status quo now. And
because there are penalties now. So
there are penalties now,
okay,
exactly.
So let's talk about that. Back then, it was different. Joan, was it?
No, I mean, back then I wasn't spewing, you know, racial garbage. So, you know, I assume most of the white people in this room weren't either. So,
but if you were, delete those tweets because
we'll find them.
Yeah, definitely.
But you know what I'm saying in terms of that sort of excuse of, well, it was different. I think the minute you
say, I'm not that person, you really have lost the argument and you've lost your credibility with me, or, you know, because you are that person and you can't blame the times. Can we ever forgive that person or, you know, let them rehabilitate their career in the public square? You know, I think really depends on accountability and admitting I am that person. And I have changed in these ways and with some, you know, demonstrating it somehow. But you really do get the feeling with a lot of these things that all that's changed is that there's a penalty now. And if there wasn't a penalty, you would not be disowning and you'd still be that person.
Tanzina?
I've lost so much faith in the public apology because it's something that's used so often for every transgression, big or small, from, you know, what our federal government is doing with our national security on to, you know, Aaron Schlossberg, who I will, unfortunately, apparently is my target today.
Or I think like even Applebee's took away a menu item and had to go like, I'm not sure if it was Applebee's, but some restaurant had to go private because they took away a menu item and they issued a public apology. And so
right,
I think like
everybody
it's just
has
ubiquitous.
an apology, right? It's just the first thing you do to CYA. I think we all know what that means. And like, to me, I mean,
cover your ass.
Right. Was this happening 30 years ago? It absolutely was happening 30 years ago. And it was encouraged in some circles. And it was not curbed, right? That's why we have the films that we were just seeing, right? It was accepted in a lot of ways.
I still really need and want to get to this question of how do we manage racism of the past?
Well, I wanted to address that because I think the question is who should be managing that from the past, right? And that's what I meant, which I was trying to get to earlier when I said, I think the question of being tired of explaining, being tired of being the one to come out and say, okay, now we gotta, you know, rake you over the coals because you did a bad race thing and we gotta, you know, I'm tired of that job. I don't want that job anymore. I think it's people's own responsibility to a certain extent to enough with the public bullshit apologies. Like, let's get to the core of what's happening.
And
right?
what is that?
Aaron Schlossberg is going to most likely be reemployed, right? A lot of folks who are doing what permit patty and that's temporary job
probably got
loss.
book
That's not
deals.
long term, right? Exactly.
Right.
You're gonna. I mean, like Rachel Dolezal got a book deal.
Don't even.
For God's sake.
How
mean,
could
we're
you?
talking
How
about-
could you?
I did.
Tanzina?
What?
Nope.
Come on. So I
Forget
think
that. You heard that.
you know, what do we do? I don't know if I need that to be my job.
I think
I'll
that,
do it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank
Joan.
you.
Thanks, Joan. We needed somebody to step up.
A white woman.
Exactly.
But I think too that it comes down to wealth redistribution, because I think if you make profits off of criminalizing or denigrating or dismissing people of color, disabled folks, LGBTQ folks, and you've made profit off of that, we live in a capitalist system, and ultimately your perpetration of that has denied other people opportunities to wealth. And so I think about like Reconstruction after slavery had ended, there was this push to redistribute the land of slave owners, because essentially Black people who were enslaved had cultivated those farms and had created that wealth and were denied that wealth because of the system of slavery. But then it was, white Southerners who went up to Washington and were like, dude, no. And the dude in charge was like, you're right, whiteness comes first. And so that was never redistributed. But I think that it's, say Paramount, for example, if Paramount had, all of this income because of these racist films, they should really look at redistributing that, whether it's through, the direct wealth or by hiring, screenwriters and producers of color to create new content instead of doing all of these reboots that just rehash and recreate the systems that we're familiar with. But I think it's going to take a reckoning and a cultural shift for that to even be acceptable or fathomable.
Joan, I want to ask you because I recognize what you're saying, and I agree of what should, could, might be, but I also feel like there are these individual experiences where it's the term stuck in my craw or whatever, right? And I don't know how to manage that. And I think,
Can you give me an example?
For every one of me, there are several Black folks who have had an incident where a colleague or a supervisor has been blatantly racist. And in that moment, you're sort of like, the fuck, right? But it just went undealt with.
I actually had an example where that didn't happen. And it was a really bizarre, I don't want to name names, but it was a white woman with me who was my editor at the time, and an executive that I had never met before. And we started talking about, Puerto Rico, and somehow in 5-10 minutes he's talking about building a wall in Mexico, and it's really awkward, right? It's really awkward. So I'm just like, okay. So the woman who was my editor walked away with this person, and I had to end the conversation. It was so uncomfortable. She came back to me later, and she was horrified. She was horrified by what he said. And she said, you know what? I had to pull him aside after we walked away from you to tell him something about what he said and how it was inappropriate. It was considered a microaggression. I mean, I don't know what training she had been through, but it was amazing.
It was effective. Job.
Oh, he absolutely
Right?
kept his job.
Sure.
But
And
that was what I was saying
I can
earlier.
give you
These people
a
keep their jobs.
Myriad examples of that. But the job is kept, the person.
Of course.
But the interesting thing is, what if it had been the person of color to speak up and say something
That's
against
the
that
problem.
person?
You can't be that person.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I remember I was in a conference meeting where we were suggesting like consultants to work with, and I've had many jobs at this point, and I'm now retired, JK, unemployed. But I just remember that I had said, oh no, we can't work with that person, they're horribly racist. And in like the room, the oxygen.
Wait, you said that?
Yeah, I said we can't work with that person, they're horribly racist, just because I had like such a visceral response because I had worked with that person.
And because you should be able to say that.
Yeah. And I just felt like the oxygen left the room. And then like 2 weeks later, my supervisor was like, Blair, so I heard that you said this thing. And I was like, yeah, but they're horribly racist. Like, it was like more of a problem that I said somebody was horribly racist and like
Then
had
they
receipts
were racist, right?
than the person was racist. Because I was out of line.
In their opinion.
In their opinion. In their incorrect opinion.
When that should be disqualifying, and you should have to be the one who brings it up. But
Shouldn't
if you
it?
do bring it up, it should be, well, of course we wouldn't work with this person who has shown themselves to be racist.
But instead it was like, but other than racism, they're such a great
great.
worker. And it's like, no, but that's it should be viewed as an incompatibility with the mission getting done than it is, you know, a small indictment on their character. Like, oh, sometimes they don't wear socks that match their shoes.
All right, exactly. So let's bring it like really close to home. So Walter Hill is the director and writer of 48 Hours. You've seen the clip. You run into him, somehow recognize him or whatever, you're introduced to him. What do you say, Joan?
What do I say? In passing, would I just go up to him and say, you know, that film was incredibly racist? Maybe. I'd like to think so. I don't know.
I would. I'll tweet it right now.
Okay, so let's tell him now. I don't even know if he's alive.
He is.
He is.
I
Okay,
checked.
checked.
Yep.
You
Is
checked.
he on
Okay.
Twitter?
Yeah, I don't think he's on Twitter, but he's
Probably
alive.
not on Twitter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's got to be part of the conversation. It's got to be, you know, and I have been that person, and I've been that person in my own family, where you have to confront the obvious racism, and you know, I don't know what more you do. Does he not work again?
Right.
You know.
Right. Tanzina, do racists lose job, credibility, opportunity? What? No. I'm asking you what should happen.
They?
Oh, should they?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that should be, should they not be employed? Should they? I'm just trying to figure out what the...
I'm asking you. I'm saying, you know, Walter Hill, or be it Walter Hill or you know, Friedland from Netflix, you know, the director of communications, y'all.
If we've learned anything, we're learning that regardless of whether or not someone remains employed at a traditional employer, I'm looking at the Me Too movement line of wonderful men that we...
Disgraced men, I love that.
Disgraced men, correct.
That moniker.
You're going to find a way to remain employed. You're going to find a way in this country to get whatever that message is out. So do I think they should be employed? Not with me. But will they remain employed? Absolutely. I think we're seeing that at WBAI right now.
We sure have.
I think it's interesting because I think whether or not a person is called out has a lot to do with whether or not you want to work with them or you feel like they can do something for you. And I really kind of call on the public at large to deconstruct that, because I think that so much of it, like, you know, you say you call out your family, but so many people are afraid to call out their family because they're afraid of rejection. But I'm happy to be at a point where if somebody isn't, you know, ascribing to what I view as like a human rights agenda, and I'm also just like, I repel people at this point who aren't into it because I'm like such an activist woke person. That if people are kind of like on the edge, they're like, oh, okay, I can't hang. But I would also just ask folks to like investigate whether or not you're comfortable being around that person and what privilege you're ready to give up to call it out. Because if we're not ready to have a cultural shift, which is going to require people to be uncomfortable and to give up opportunities and to, you know, speak out publicly, we won't have any change. But in terms of like people not having, you know, racists not having jobs, you already heard me talk about property redistribution. So that's how I feel about it.
Redistribute the jobs.
Yes.
We're ready.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. Yes, right out front.
Wait for the mic.
Hello, my name is Odochi, and I am a journalist and a podcaster, and I'm super excited to be here. But my question is, now Steven Spielberg is redoing West Side Story, and now actually having Latinas instead of only having Rita Moreno and a bunch of people in brownface. So it's like with movies like that, because like I grew up watching that with my mom. I love that movie. Like, are we supposed to just remove it from our culture, or is it just making it new? Or how do we reconcile something being extremely racist but also so deeply in our culture and a part of something that is, people are still mimicking it now in different ways in different movies and genres? So how do we move past the racism and still enjoy it?
I want to just say something quickly, and then I'll open it up to the panel. we have to be vigilant about art makers, okay, and looking at the history of the work that they make. Steven Spielberg, who you may or may not know, has adopted children of color. He has also made profoundly racist films, and has taken it upon himself in a sort of entitled way. You know, he did The Color Purple, he did Amistad. He's done a bunch of films that depict Black culture and now evidently Latino and Puerto Rican culture. I think that we have to hold artists individually accountable. And when you say, do we just enjoy it and pass over the racism? I don't think we can. I personally can never pass over the racism. And I am specifically concerned and critical of Steven Spielberg, who is viewed as the most famous but also accomplished filmmaker in America, right? So I think that, you know, we have to be vigilant. We have to look at the work that precedes them, and we have to ask these questions in ways that are on podcasts or that are in pieces or that are in conversation, so that in whatever small way maybe it reaches him.
I don't think we should erase what's come prior to us. And that's, you know, I'm speaking as a journalist, I'm speaking as just a human being. I mean, I remember looking up something about, I was writing something about the administration, and when the Trump administration came out with their top 10-point plan for Black America, I eagerly went back to look for it one day to find it again, and it was gone. And I use that as an example because it's just 2 sheets of paper, right? But we can't erase our history. I think that's why we got where we are today, because we've tried to do that and sanitize it. I don't think we should get rid of West Side Story, its original. We need to understand why that happened, contextualize it, and keep that. I think where we go from here, but if I'm not mistaken, Spielberg was looking for native Spanish speakers only, or Spanish speakers, and that's nice, but not all Latinos speak Spanish, and I think that that's a skill that, you know, if you didn't need it for the first version, you might not need it for this version, just saying. I think there needs to be a reflection of the diasporic, you know, vision of what Puerto Ricans really look like, not just, you know, one vision of what they look like.
Not just the light-skinned,
straight-haired version.
straight-haired
version, you know? And I think that that the story in and of itself might have to be, you know, looked at. But should we erase it? I taught at Princeton 2 semesters ago, and there was an interesting debate about this one student who wanted to prevent The Birth of a Nation from being shown on campus.
The original.
Yes, the original. And she goes, you know, I just disagree. I didn't really agree with that. I think if it's shown in context with a discussion about what this film represents and what it meant and all the bells and whistles that need to go along with that, there has to be a responsibility for the art that's then put out there. And we do this with the classics, right? Nobody's saying, you know what, Moby Dick, get rid of it.
This
I don't
reminds
want
me
to
of
see it anymore.
When I was like in middle school, and I was like very shy, but also like super militant. I only hung out in the library, and I was like trying to talk to our librarian about like making sure that like Huckleberry Finn was never read again. Not because it had the N-word in it, but because our teachers weren't equipped to teach us about it. And I feel like there are infinitely better books, and that we kind of put these books on a pedestal. And that was interesting for me because I felt in my evolution, like had it been like a really amazing book that like brought you on a journey, not just like, I didn't like Huckleberry Finn because it defined the American experience from a young white boy's perspective, and I felt like that was inaccurate to the truth and beauty of America. And then it had the N-word in it as like, oh, we have to learn about our history. But we weren't learning about the Harlem Renaissance. We weren't learning about
Jim Crow.
You know, we weren't learning about Jim Crow. We weren't learning about slavery and why there was an enslaved person who was escaping in that story. And so I think that we can't be kind of we can't watch things in a passive way. But also, there have been like the Rachel Dolezal film. A lot of people who want to watch it out of like curiosity, we're pirating that shit. We're not gonna let her get her money from Netflix. Not me personally. I don't.
Y'all had to
interact.
bring that shit up. I just wow.
Second
Sorry,
time.
but I think that's an example of like you have to figure out if you want your views and your attention to it to allow Spielberg to prosper, or if you're just watching it for like your own edification. And we have to be responsible viewers, and we have to be responsible with our funds that way as well.
Just one more thing. I think it's very interesting that, because when I heard that they were remaking it with a Latino cast, I was hoping that it was going to be maybe some like person of color or Latino director, and then I see like Steven Spielberg. So I feel like it's the same thing of like what you were saying before, Blair, of white corporations trying to like fix the racism. It's like this savior coming down and
they want to
making
make
this
it look
movie.
diverse, but they don't want to hear from us.
I agree
Or
with
they
that. I
hear
think
from
that
us and then they
happens.
make the decision still.
Yeah.
It's like, let me hear your feedback.
Right.
Oh, you said it's
Then I'll continue
racist?
to
We're
make
going to
the
do it
decision.
anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Hi, Jamie.
Yes.
Who
It's the EGOT.
was born in Puerto Rico, who is 86 years old, who came to New York when she was 5. I'm not saying you have to go see the original West Side Story. I have a lot of very strong
But
feelings
shout out to
about
Rita
it.
Moreno.
But I want to give a shout out to Rita Moreno because I love her.
And she has the
And
Emmy,
she
the
had a
Tony,
very,
the
very
Grammy,
hard
the
time
Oscar.
in Hollywood as a Puerto Riqueña. And she made it, and she's making it still. And you can buy her book and read it. And give her some money because she is a woman of color. So that's all I want to say.
Jamie, you don't have a question?
Thank you,
Come on, girl.
Jamie.
While
No,
we're
it's
doing
not my
shout outs.
I'm absorbing your brilliance, women's.
Okay,
Women's, shine on.
I promised that I would shout out Patrice Okumo, who is the woman who climbed the Statue of Liberty. I just wanted to like acknowledge her, and then Anne Rubin, who's one of like her teammates. But I think that this whole diversity conversation is really interesting because it's interesting how we commodify and then shift our attention from these amazing people.
Blair, I want to say and be clear as sort of producer, host, and creator of this series. This is not a diversity series.
Oh, girl, I know.
I don't do I don't do diversity, right? Like we talk about race, we talk about racism, we talk about the ways in which we falter in terms of inclusiveness. We talk about language and the ways that we need to reinvent language and talk about things, the social construct.
But this is way too deep to just be a diversity conversation.
That's what I'm saying.
You solid.
Hello.
Hello.
I've heard recently, anyway, there's been this argument that when the permit patties and the barbecue Beckys, they become viral and then they lose their jobs, that it isn't the right reaction for people to go after them as strongly or for them to lose their jobs because it pushes them toward racism even further.
Oh, like
it
they were already there, though.
They were, yes, but that
You
it,
mean like
it
further
doesn't,
into white supremacy?
Yes, but that it doesn't teach them a lesson in the way of trying, I guess, not to be racist, or for them to kind of understand where we're coming from.
I hear that a lot too with like.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hear that a lot too with like homophobes, like folks who are viscerally opposed to like gay people existing and thriving and living, and it's like, well, if you kick them, if you tell them that they're wrong, they're going to hate you more, and it's like, fam, they already hated you. And so I think this whole idea of like, well, it doesn't teach them. Do these people want to learn, or are they literally calling the police because I'm having a good time with my family at a barbecue, or I'm selling water to people on a hot day? But we coddle racists in this country. We coddle racists. We coddle rapists. We make it very comfortable for people who are oppressors, because that's what is the dominant culture in American society, are people who perpetrate violences against people of color and marginalized folks. So I think it's very natural for folks who live in this society and who kind of drink the Kool-Aid to defend the permit patties and barbecue Beckys. But the reality is that there's a right and a wrong, and we can't have this conversation in a vacuum that doesn't talk about power.
I am slightly sympathetic, or I find myself grappling with that argument, because I do believe in forgiveness and I believe in second chances, but we're in a period of social crisis. And when you want the rules to change desperately, then the rules have to be enforced. And so if calling the police on Black people for just going about their daily lives shouldn't be a thing, I think it helps. I don't know if it's going to help Barbecue Becky, probably not, or the people that it happens to, but I actually think that other white people are learning, maybe getting enlightened, maybe getting scared, maybe, you know, some of the social.
I mean, we can't live with the threat of always angering white people and, oh my God, what's going to happen if I do that? You know, and that's what ends up happening.
If you looked at the video of Permit Patty, she was crouching behind a pillar because she knew her face was going to be all over Twitter.
Holmes, did you see that guy, the CVS employee who was like this guy? Shaking, calling on a Black woman trying to use her coupon? I think one thing I would say is that I don't want to be a teaching moment. I don't want my trauma or the legacy of violence and racism towards Black people to be a teaching moment at any point. We've got to get beyond that so that, you know, if people are learning, great, talk amongst yourselves. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Go get your people.
Pardon?
It's like, go get your people, you know?
Go get your people for sure. But I don't find any comfort whatsoever in people saying, you know, we're going to learn from this moment and I need for you to be in this moment for us to learn and be a teaching moment. Question?
That was a great question,
Yes.
by the way. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I have no voice.
Oh.
Yay. So thank you all. I've known about this event for quite some time. I tweeted it. I texted people. People came. So I'm thrilled.
Thank you.
Yes. Salute. So I'm Kanani Ayo Holder. I'm an educator. I'm a performer. I'm an activist. I actually performed as Rachel Dolezal off Broadway, and it was sold out.
What?
Yeah, I did. I think people.
Third time.
We got to talk later. That's dope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was really fun. And it was very interactive. So the premise was that the theater would be the audience would be interactive. So they really grilled me as if I was Rachel. So I do improv, but I was like, oh my God, these people are really, they're really attacking me like I'm Rachel. Thank you. Yes, we have a witness. So my question is, I do diversity training. I think the word diversity is BS because it always still
Censors
is from
whiteness.
Yes, it's still from a white lens of we will let you in to what is already an established space. But hey, it's the easy word for people to say, do that for us. So there's one particular client, and I've done this before, with white elite spaces, and then they let one or two darkies in. And then they realize, oh, oops, that the elite ones then on Snapchat and in their face will be very disparaging to the others, assume that they are poor, illiterate, a litany of pathology. Now, this one particular client, I'm like, well, did you have a no tolerance, zero tolerance policy before you put out the call to apply for this thing and pay all the money and have these students come? But I'm curious from you, how do you navigate talking to a client when it's you know exactly what you want to say because it's going in, really? Right? And they always seem like they're confused, they didn't think they would get to this.
Why? It's just so racist here. We just don't know why.
Right.
We throw away every resume that says Jamal or DeAndre, but we don't know why it's so racist.
Right. Because it's you call it diversity, but really it's crisis management.
Mm-hmm. Speak the question again.
So what do we, because I'm not the only one that engages in these diversity conversations, how do I go about just straight up saying look, in order to stop this from happening in the future, you need to have these parameters in place in a way that doesn't offend them, scare them.
You say that. You say exactly that.
Exactly that.
The stakes are too high at this point. Mm-hmm. We cannot tone it or dial it down. I mean, I really believe it's balls to the walls at this point. The stakes are too high. Look, this is why we're having this conversation. Do you see what is happening? And so, okay, offending people, white people, you've got to let that go. You've got to let that go.
I don't let it go. I'm straight to the, like, I'm usually to the point where I'll sacrifice.
But what I usually do is connect it to the bottom line. I think that folks expect a certain amount of spiciness from me, a little bit of bite, you know. I feel I've often said that people bring me in to like make them cry, and then they like go back to like, you know, the day to day. But really connecting it to the bottom line and making it understand that it's going to hurt their pockets if they're continuing to ignore demographics. I was consulting for one company that wasn't even viewing, you know, like young Black people as consumers. And I was like, you have to look at how much money we spend if you're trying to reach out to us and then make us want your product. You're not treating us like we're valuable, but we're, you know, you simultaneously want us to value your product while not viewing us as valuable and not doing things in line or in support of us. This is a conversation that I had with PETA. They were like, why don't we have so many Black people like on board with the animal rights conversation? And it's like, well, you keep comparing shit to slavery, and slavery is real. Like, you know, like you can't act like this is something that is past and metaphorical when it's a real conversation now. You can't blame Black people for not being vegan when vegetables and fruits are so out of touch or are so out of reach. And so I think contextualizing it really helps because folks of us who are woke, we already think about the context, but for them it's brand new. They feel like it's an incident-to-incident situation when it is a system.
I've written entire articles about this, like 10-point plan, Google me and that, and it's right there.
Thank you.
One last question down here up front.
Okay, well, speaking on the crisis management, I think we all remember Justine Sacco, the lady who was in communications.
Hope I don't get AIDS.
Yes, exactly. So she tweeted before going on her flight to South Africa, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I am white. And then 4 years later, flash forward, she got... So flash forward, she's back with that same firm. She got her job, just with a different client. And the CEO, he wrote in a statement, with one notable exception, Justine's track record speaks for itself. Very few people in the business world have Justine's spirit, tenacity, and drive to persevere, and et cetera, et cetera. So the thing is, you know, she was able to, like you said, these permanent patties, barbecue patties, will get their job or stay, you know, get a job back eventually. But, you know, me being a woman of color and someone who is from Africa, I don't think if I, you know, my track record, if it was one exception, I don't think I'd be able to get a job back, and certainly not in the same field. So how can I, you know, go about my life not feeling so discouraged or, you know, because all these videos, they get tiring, you know? It's like exhausting to see it happen on a weekly basis. So, I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on that? I know that was a lot.
And not to answer your question, but to add to it, like we look at Chiquisha Clemens, who was the woman who was beaten at Waffle House. She lost her job because it was quote unquote too much heat on where she worked. So even if you're a victim of racism, you get treated the same way as if you were calling the police on you know, a group of a Black family. So I think it's a very poignant point. It's not abstract. It is real life. It's really happening.
One of the most frustrating things, and I've talked about this a lot when we talk about diversity, is how, particularly in Silicon Valley, the narrative of fail up or, you know, break things and no, we can't break things. I've never felt like I could break anything, right? And I've also got, you know, many years of professional experience, so I've been in different scenarios where I've had to find my way and say, okay, well, how can I be ambitious and creative and still, you know, and still be me? And that's not an easy thing to do. I think, you know, we saw that with the New York Times. I was the most ambitious and creative I could possibly have been, handing them, you know, the most important beat, essentially, of the decade. And doing it single-handedly on multiple platforms, and even that wasn't good enough. So there comes a point, I think, and hopefully that we're laying, you know, my generation and those of us who are older are laying some of the foundation so you don't have to deal with that. I think we have to remember that, you know, things come in stages and different generations handle things differently. But that's been, I think, the crux of my professional experience has been, when do I get to, quote unquote, fail or break something and still be okay without having to be perfect? And that's a very difficult thing to do, very difficult thing. And I think we need to acknowledge how difficult that is for women of color in particular, especially if you're not, wealthy. I mean, there are real limitations. So, hopefully we're laying some groundwork so you can feel that we did it, and you don't have to do that, but it is hard.
You'll have to do other things.
Mm-hmm. You have to deal with other stuff, right.
And I think that your spirit, your fighting spirit will really serve you, And so Tanzina is saying, yes, those of us of a certain generation are going to lay some groundwork, but you need to still engage with your spirit and your fighting spirit and your ambition, and to trust that and follow that.
And that is so key, because if you don't trust yourself, and if you're not, there has to be a certain amount of self-awareness that I think a lot of young people today, and not to pick on young people, because there's also 100-year-olds who are not self-aware. So it's not just young people, but a lot of people do lack a certain amount of self-awareness. Not you, Blair. You're more self-aware than half the people I know, but seriously.
I'm on Ritalin.
But it's a whole nother conversation. But I do think that self-awareness, you grow into that as a professional. You grow into knowing your limits, the company's limits, the organization's limits, how much you are allowed to push versus not. Being ambitious is okay, right? And I think I would never say don't be ambitious, right? For me to sit down with the executive editor of the New York Times and say, I have an idea, right? Here you go, okay? And then to take the L afterwards and say, you know what, that's all right, I'm gonna keep it moving. I'm gonna go to the next big newsroom I can get into, right? I didn't let that stop me. I'm not going to say it wasn't devastating and painful. It absolutely was. And we need to make space to talk about that, right? But that sure as hell wasn't going to stop me. It just meant, all right, not happening here. Maybe it's going to happen over there.
I'm going to say two quick things. I'm literally just going to repeat something that Amani Al-Khattab said yesterday when I was listening to her speak at the Guggenheim. And she was like, I look at to her as like a mentor and a friend. Like, she was saying that we really have to build our own institutions so that we have something to fall back on when a white institution says we can't, because that's what's going to be our power, is to be like, oh, I can't publish this here. Well, I'm going to publish it in OK Africa. They want to hear what I have to say. And this is about me speaking to my own people. But the other thing is that Carmen Berkeley and Tiffany Lofton created this like flowchart of what to do when something wild happens. And that's like when somebody comes in and says, oh, you look so exotic, or you speak so well. Oh, no. It's so that you don't short circuit in that moment. You kind of have it in your back pocket, and it's a deconstruction of everything from what do I want to what do we want, we being the other Black people who work at this organization, or we, the people who might work here in another time. So you can really be strategic about breaking down this moments. But one of the most fruitful things for me, like working in white organizations and now being freelance, which is like so great, but I'm broke, is having somebody you can talk to off-site. Not at, you never want to talk about it at your office, but somebody who can talk to offsite, or somebody from college, or somebody from back home that you can decompress with, because the reality is that we are dealing with this shit, and the shit isn't going away, but we have to let that shit ruin our spirit, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. And so if you're able to have somebody you can talk with and, wasn't that racist? Yeah, it was racist. Just so you don't go wild yourself in these wild moments, so that way you can stay true to, no, that wasn't supposed to happen to me. I shouldn't be treated that way, and really hold firm to the fact that the way the world treats you isn't who you are.
Which ultimately builds the strength that you need. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much for coming out. Joan Walsh, Tanzina Vega, and Blair Imani. You guys, thank you. Thank you.
Follow me on Twitter.
Thank you. We did that.